Hello, nurses. Welcome back to Staff Development Nurse. In this video, I want to share with you how you can increase your documentation compliance in 1 month. Yes, 1 month. It can be done, and I'm going to show you how. So the first thing I want to do is go over a brief case study with you. And this is a case study of a facility that I have worked with for consultant work and how I was able to increase their documentation compliance rate by 20% within 1 month of the changes being made. Now, this facility was a 140 bed facility. They have a combo of skilled nursing and long-term care, and their documentation compliance was at 75% when they called me into the building to try to figure out what we could do to fix this documentation issue. Now, anytime I go into a building, I always want to get the facility perspective. And when I say facility perspective, I'm referring to those who were instrumental in bringing me into the building itself. And this primarily is focused on administration. Now, their thought process as the primary cause of documentation being so poor in the building was staffing, right? This should come to no surprise to you. Across the country, many facilities are struggling with staffing. And in this particular building, just like many other buildings, this huge struggle was with CNAs. All right. They had to go to an agency to help get enough help to care for the residents. And they felt that this was a huge factor in documentation issues because there were so many different agency staff members coming into the building. Now, from my observation and from speaking with the staff, I was able to pinpoint where the true problem lied, right? Computer documentation was actually very good. The real issue was the documentation on paper. So with this information in hand, we were able to make some really simple changes in the building that had some very drastic effects. So the first thing we changed was making sure that documentation was consistent across the building, like the standards of storing the documents and the forms. We just made sure it was consistent. The first thing I noticed right away is that each unit had their own filing system for documentation. And it was very confusing for me as an outsider. And let me break down to you what I mean. Every floor or unit had their documentation stored in different binders. All of those binders were different colors. All of those binders were labeled something completely different. Some units had 2 or 3 forms that will be found in one binder, and then another type of form will be found in a separate binder. And so essentially it was causing CNAs sometimes to have to go to 3 or 4 binders just to complete their documentation for their specific section or assignment. And it became very confusing because a lot of these staff members were floating throughout the building, going unit to unit, and there was just no consistency on what the book looks like, what the book is labeled as, or even where to find the book, right? So they were stored all over the place in different areas on the unit, and it just became very, very confusing. So we made sure we changed all of those things. The first thing we did was take away all the 3 or 4 books that CNAs had to go to, and we condensed all of the CNA documentation into one book, and we labeled this our ADL binder. We made sure all of our ADL binders had clear, legible tabs in them that separated the residents by room number and not by name, because this was another thing that we saw. We made sure that we put all the forms in that one book. Everything was the same color on every unit. We labeled it exactly the same on every unit, and we stored it in very similar locations on every unit. The next thing we did was condense forms. And in this circumstances, less was definitely more. What I found was that there would be multiple forms of documentation that was required, but a lot of those forms had the same information on it. It was a little redundant in some standpoints. And as I drilled down, what I found was that some other disciplines had created their own specific forms of documentation, and they would just go up on a unit and put it into the book for the CNAs to document on. The problem is it never crossed the hands of the unit manager. There was no communication back and forth in a morning meeting to kind of look at the documentation that was requested or to see if there was a way to condense everything onto one specific form. So it really just became like an overload of documentation that the CNAs just could not keep up with. And what we were able to do was condense those forms. So one form that we were able to condense was our bowel and bladder diary. Now we know this is done over a 72-hour window, and it has to be documented on every 2 hours. So it's one of those dreaded forms that you have to constantly check to make sure documentation is complete. What we're able to do is take that bowel and bladder diary, and instead of having one diary for 3 separate days on 3 separate sheets of paper, we were able to condense it where all 3 days was on one piece of paper. And there is a link below this video for that bowel and bladder diary that you can easily download. All right, so just condensing the forms made a huge difference because it made it more likely for people to document versus missing something because they had to flip to another page. And I will say the bowel and bladder diary was our biggest culprit when it came to missing documentation. All right, keep clean master copies. When I came onto the floor, I found some copies that were pretty much illegible. Like I really could not read many of the words on there. The charts or graphs were kind of swaying down to the side on a slant. And it was very easy to see that this was just a matter of copying a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy over and over again, and the quality just sinks. So what we did was we created master copy books. Again, they all were the same color, they all were labeled exactly the same, and we placed these books on similar locations on every unit. We made sure we took our master copy, just wrote over it with a yellow highlighter. Yellow's great because it won't show up on a copy machine, that it was an original. Now, one other great change we made in talking with the staff members was that we actually copied the forms on a specific sheet of colored paper. And this was brought up by CNA because they felt as though having just every single page being white, the tabs being white, it's very easy for those sheets of paper to blend in and to skip over them inadvertently, not on purpose. So what we did was we used colored paper to make copies that were still just black and white, or black ink rather. But we used that. So anytime we needed to make a copy of a form, we would refer back to that master's book and correlating it back to a specific color. And this made it so much easier for the CNAs to actually see the difference as they flipped through the chart itself. And it really helped with not missing sheets of paper because they were too colorful to miss. The last thing we did was communicate with the team. I think this is one very overlooked area that can make one of the greatest impacts in your building. So the reason why the program was so successful was because the team had input and they had buy-in into the process. And what I mean by that is I reached out directly to frontline staff members. I did not have administration involved in these meetups where we would discuss documentation. I wanted them to feel very comfortable and honest to give me a true picture of what the documentation challenges were in the building. And because they were able to give suggestions, they were able to give ideas, they were able to get input and feedback. Because they were able to do all of these things, we really had like a rallying of support on the floor from those members who participated in those meetings to get the documentation done, and it made a world of difference. We also came up with a plan to create a communication board for the staff that they could go to a centralized location and see any changes that's happening in the building. Now, these could be changes with forms, it could be changes with policies and procedures. The key, though, to making the sport successful is making sure you're rotating out what you're putting on the board. And so what we got back was that some staff members never looked at boards because it was overwhelming. It was too many sheets of paper on the board. And then many times those papers were literally years old. Like, I literally removed a piece of paper from like 2018 off of the board itself. So just make sure that you're updating and rotating that information. We came up with a plan that every month, we'll do it for 30 days. We'll actually update and rotate the information that's on the board itself, just so it's always fresh and new, and it doesn't just become, oh, the board with all the paper on it that nobody pays attention to. All right. So as you can see, the changes we made were very minimal. It didn't take a lot of effort. It did not take a lot of time to implement these changes, but they were so powerful that they were able to increase their compliance rate by 20% in 1 month. So I hope you got some information out of this video. It gives you some ideas of starting points that you can utilize in your facility just to increase your documentation compliance rate. And make sure you subscribe. This way, as I upload new videos, you can get a notification and check it out to see if it can help you in your journey. All right, thank you so much for watching this video today, and I can't wait to put the next video up for you.